Hello students, I want to review how we are sewing our pizza. First, you'll need to get thread. Get about 3 feet of thread, snip it at the end, and then you'll need to thread your needle. That means sticking the thread through the eye of the needle. And in another video, I showed some cheating techniques for getting that through if you find it challenging. For this project, I have some pretty thin thread, so it's fine enough to tie the thread onto your needle. To do that, you make a U. That was an upside down U. Then you make an O with a curly Q. Then you bring the end of that thread up through the hole. And that single knot is probably going to be fine for just keeping your needle tethered on. Most sewing you would not tie the knot, but for this one, it's easy to do. Down at the other end of the thread, you do the same thing. Create a U, turn it into an O, then bring that tip up through the hole. Because we want the knot to be thick, you can do that 2 or 3 times, keeping them loose each time. Then when you slowly pull those knots together, they'll make one larger knot. Really thin thread like this, I'll show you another little technique. If that knot still isn't big enough, you can wrap it around your finger loosely about 3 times. Roll it off of your finger so that it twists up into a big nest, and then pull down from the straight part of the thread until a knot forms, and that'll be a big chunky knot. To begin, you put your needle between the 2 pieces of fabric. That way, that knot is hidden inside. And from this point, you can begin your whip stitch. That means you come up from one direction each stitch, stitching small, even stitches. I'm starting in the bottom, making sure the needle goes through both pieces of fabric, and then continuing by pulling it back out of the top and going back up through the back. So back, up, and through. And with each stitch, you slowly pull the thread. If you pull real quickly, sometimes you get a snag. Then you have to cut your thread off and start over. Sewing itself is actually a short process. It's getting the needle ready, tying the knots, threading the needle, and cutting the fabric that takes the longest. So if you're sewing, don't fear that your work will be all for lost if you have to stop and redo your stitches. That's the fast part. So relax into creating your stitches. I'm kind of holding my pizza dough fabric there to keep it from getting squinchy. And you always want to stop stitching when your needle is matching the size of the rest of your thread. So there, the needle is just slightly shorter than the remaining thread, and it's time to tie some knots. I like to pull a stitch through and then catch that loop before I pull it tight. I like to do that like 3 times. So I make a stitch, I put the tip of the needle through it before it closes down, and I kind of lock that stitch in place with lots of those little knots. You'll see though that here I didn't do it enough and I end up with a problem later. You can cut your needle off, and then it is time to decorate this pizza. I can also get that totally off. If I wanted to start to sew again, I would get new thread and begin with putting the needle on and tying a knot on the other end. But it is actually time to decorate here because there's just a little room left. If you're going to want a piece of fabric to cover the whole surface of the pizza, like this pizza sauce, you can use that original template or a slightly smaller one to estimate the size. So I did a tip using that same template, and that will fit really nicely on top of my pizza shape. I kind of made a wobbly edge to show that it's saucy. And I'll try it out, fit it on. I love it, a nice big thick crust. Then you'll use fabric glue to stick these parts on. Tacky glue is really good stuff, but it takes a little while to dry, and you'll have to do a lot of pressing to make sure it adheres. You want to try to aim to have it not squirt out the sides, and that means you might have to add some under the edges later to make sure it really stays on. For really tiny pieces like cheese, I'm just going to apply the glue right on top. If I were going to do tiny black olives or mushrooms or narrow pieces of green pepper, I would do that too. Next, hopefully there's time for your glue to dry, but in this demo, I'm super hurried, so I'm going to start stuffing right away. And I start with a small amount of stuffing that I'm going to push down into the tip using gravity and using a chopstick. You want to make sure and get the polyfill throughout your whole slice, whether you want it to be a really plump pillow or more of like a floppy pizza slice, you decide. So I'm getting glue all over the place since I didn't let my glue dry, and it's making it more challenging to stuff. Hopefully you can wait a little bit longer before you stuff your pizza. And now it's time to thread your needle once more, put a knot in the end, and do some stitching right over your old stitches so that you can finish closing your pizza. This part is a little more challenging since it is stuffed. You'll want to pinch the fabric closed with one hand while you sew, trying to keep it all nice and lined up. This is likely one of your first sewing projects, so don't get frustrated with yourself, don't get impatient. And then remember to finish it off with several of those lock stitches where you make your stitch as usual, but then make sure and poke your needle up through that hoop as it closes. I'm going to do that like 2 or 3 times to lock it in place. And then I'm even going to do a little cheat at the end where I add a dot of glue to the knot just to make sure it never comes undone.